Harold Beaumont.
Much, Mr Chair. Look, I rise to speak on Part 1 of the Policing Storage of Youth Identifying Particulars Amendment Bill, and let me just start. I will talk about the clauses 4 and 5 in Part 1 and what they actually do, but essentially, before I do that, I do need to comment on points made by the last speaker around this bill, because the intention is very narrow, it is very simple. There was a mistake made. It deals with a particular, very narrow circumstance about maintaining, identifying particulars of young people, and it was not a constitutional outrage, it was a drafting error. It was a drafting error, and we have a bill now to rectify a drafting error, which the impact of was to accidentally omit some words that need to be in here. So I just find it quite extraordinary that we would see that this is the way to deal with what are very serious issues that I've raised in this debate, that Green members have raised, and that the Māori Party have raised about our young people, about the causes of crime, about the disproportionate impact on Māori, even the latter points that the Māori member Rahu Katani made about policing conduct. All of those are really important issues, and one I have, and I know many of my colleagues have a great deal of sympathy with. This is not the way to deal with it. So a minor, technical, narrow piece is not the way to start to deal with some of the most significant issues that face us as a country. And we need to be constantly looking at the causes of crime. We need to, as I said in my Part 2 speech, we need to be looking at the impact of poverty, inequality, unemployment, and all of those other things that are disproportionately affecting our young people. But speaking on Part 1, which is basically in Clause 4 says the bill's purpose is to amend the Principal Act so that it indicates clearly when it authorises the storage and when it requires the destruction of youth identifying particulars. The purpose is to right what went wrong in 2008 when this bill went through, and to actually, if you like, reflect the intention of Parliament at the time. And I'm somebody who actually strongly believes in following good process. But good process, surely to goodness, is about, introducing a bill, having a select committee, reflecting what happened there, and passing legislation that reflects those outcomes in this House. And obviously, in this case, the 2008 Act, as others, Leanne Dalzell, Annette King, have made the point, did not happen in that case. So the process, which actually in the case of Annette King, as she outlined, was a very substantial process with a 2-year consultation, and then the track through the House after Select Committee went wrong. It went wrong, it accidentally omitted words that needed to be there. It is a drafting error. So let's not use that to try and create a much broader debate. If we want to do that, then we should be doing that and raising the debate properly. Clause 5 in Part 1 makes it clear that the new sections substituted by Clause 6 apply and must be taken to have applied at all times after the close of 30 September 2008 to all identifying particulars obtained under the Principal Act after the commencement on 1 October 2008 of that Act. This is the retrospective part, and again, I understand why people get nervous about retrospective legislation. I doubt there are too many of us in this House that do not see why that is problematic. But in this particular case, again, it is not going to actually, it is necessary to ensure that our police are able to do the job that they are meant to be doing here, to be able to identify youth offenders, and in my opinion, identifying youth offenders and ensuring that they are dealt with appropriately is better than not identifying them and finding out much further down the track when they are much more involved in criminal activity. So I think that I will leave it there, Mr. Speaker.
David Cleandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this part clearly is the purpose. This is the heart of the Act, of the proposed legislation, and it states it seeks to amend the Principal Act, and in particular around this issue of storage of youth identifying particulars. I think it's worth just for a moment reflecting on exactly what those are. We have heard reference to fingerprints, particularly this morning. In fact, youth identifying particulars include name, address, date of birth, photographs, visual images, so presumably footage from cameras, from cell phones, whatever it might be, fingerprints, palm prints, footprints. Quite an extensive body of information potentially that's been retained in these instances for young people who have been through some youth court process. We are told, in fact, we are assured that the issue has been corrected, and we can again assume, in the absence of any information, that the youth identifying particulars that were retained post-2008 have been destroyed perhaps 8 or 10 months ago, presumably in October 2010 when this issue came to light. And one would wonder, has there been an explosion of youth offending since that time? Have the unfortunate repercussions, we are told, will follow from the inability of the police to retain this information, this youth IP. We've now got nearly a year's worth of a body of evidence to inform us whether or not there actually is a real problem here, or is it a problem that is being created. I think it reasonable to suggest that a proper process involving a select committee, involving some time for consideration and the involvement of external agencies with expertise in youth offending, in youth law, in youth, and indeed in bringing youth back onto a proper footing, to leave criminal offending behind. We have that body of information available to us, which is worth considering, I think, before we charge on and pass this legislation a couple of hours after many of us in this House were blessed with the first reading of it. There is the issue we've heard that the purpose of the Act is necessary, that we need to restore the police's ability to store the information, because it will somehow enable us to intervene more readily and at an earlier stage in dealing with youth offenders, and in particular with repeat offenders. There is somehow an assumption that having this information to hand will enable us to more readily steer youth onto a better path. And I think that's a fairly dubious proposition. I mean, our young people, indeed our young offenders, albeit they might be misguided, they wouldn't have to watch too many television programs to know how to avoid some of the leaving behind the imprints, to leaving fingerprints, to getting themselves on cameras. I do think that there's a considerable overstatement of the value of retaining this information in terms of enabling us to intervene more at an earlier stage. And I absolutely take the point I have many times advocated in this House in different contexts, that we need to intervene at the earliest opportunity. And unfortunately, a lot of the policy we've seen passed in the last 12 months or so around justice, around corrections, is actually steering us in quite the opposite direction. We are not dealing at an early stage with youth offending. We are not giving the necessary treatment. We're simply resorting to prisons at more and more routinely. We've heard the proposition that we need to consider the broader issues that underpin the purpose of this bill, which is to amend this Act, the Section 34 of the Policing Act, I think, which is the key section. And to be fair, one can, having just read that section this morning, it's clear and it's easy to see how the issue could have been overlooked. It simply states, to paraphrase, the decision from Crown Law turns on the definition of the word conviction. And obviously the legal definition of that word is such that the police were in error when they were retaining the information relating to young people, because technically that was not a conviction coming through the youth court unless it triggered that 283.0, unless the offending was such a scale. Mr. Chair?
David Clendon.
It's only if the penalty applied was involving direction to the district court that this actually became an issue. So there is I think, clear evidence that, it can be reasonably said that the fact that this issue was overlooked, that there was not an analysis or that nobody at the time picked up, that the simple declaration of that word conviction actually was going to put the police's assumptions in error, that they could continue to gather this information. It's perhaps preempting a later part of this, a later clause, but I think under the purpose we can entertain a slightly broader issue.
Order. I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but the time has come for me to leave the chair for the lunch break. Members, the House has given leave for a question time to be held today, and in accordance with that decision, the committee is therefore temporarily suspended and the Speaker will resume the chair at 2 p.m.